Welcome to Insights. I'm Dick Goldberg. About half of marriages end in divorce, and the process is almost always fraught with stress, pain, and maybe unnecessary struggle. Today we'll examine ideas and methods that could buffer this process and increase the chances of a better outcome. If you or a friend or a family member is about to embark on this process, it may pay to hear what our guest, Dr. Kenneth Waldron, is about to share with us. Ken is a clinical psychologist who's devoted the last 30 years to divorce-related issues, from private practice to published research to being a frequent expert witness in divorce and custody issues and presenting nationally to judges, lawyers, and mental health workers on divorce. Ken, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I got a tough lead question for you. Why should people going through this process listen to what you're about to tell us?
That is a tough lead question. I think that people going through a divorce are often entering it for the first time, some for the second time, but mostly for the first time. And it's an area that people don't have much information about. They don't have many models of how to go through it successfully. So I think it's useful to talk to somebody that knows something about divorce and has seen it for many years and can speak to the ways to maybe go through it in a little bit better shape, come out of it in a little better shape.
You know, when we talked about doing this, I told you I wanted to call it the good divorce, and you said you hate that. Why?
I do.
Why do you hate that?
I hate that because it's not good for the people going through it. I've heard people say that when they finish their divorce, their attorney might say something like, "Congratulations." For them, it's like a death. It's the ending of something. It's the loss of a dream. And so it's hard to call it good. I think the best people can do when they go through a divorce is come through it in as good a shape as possible. But most people are pretty sad, have lost a lot in the process, lost way more than just each other. So it's hard to see it as a good experience.
Well, this visit we're talking about people who didn't have kids or have adult kids. And when you said they've lost way more than each other, what do you mean?
Well, they've lost each other, certainly, and many of the relationships that people lose have some good in them.
Yes.
Oftentimes, one person is asking for the divorce and the other person is opposed to it. Yeah. So that person's experiencing even more loss of one another. But they lose a lot more than that. They lose a lot of money. Mm-hmm. You can't divide a marital estate and end up with two halves.
Well, wait a minute. It seemed like you could. You just cut it in half. You got two halves.
Well, two people can live pretty comfortably on $5,000 a month. One person has a lot of trouble living on half of that.
I get it. Yeah.
And two people might have retirement plans, and then suddenly, when they divide their retirement accounts, they can't retire any longer.
That's interesting. So it's economically good to be in a couple, to stretch your dollars rather than being single.
It works out a little bit better.
I never thought about that. Very interesting.
But people lose more than that. There's extended families involved. What about the husband who goes hunting with the wife's brothers every year? Yeah. What about many couples have friends that are friends of them as a couple, and after they divorce, they lose some of those friends.
And this, of course, is not part of the legal negotiations. Who gets to keep the friends?
No, it's not.
Wow. You know, if you had to guess, what percentage of couples who get divorced shouldn't have gotten divorced?
If I had to guess, well, it depends. By the time I see people, they're in the process of actually getting a divorce. And by then, most of the time, it's too late.
Why?
Because there's so much water under the bridge. The research on divorce says that the person who initiates the divorce, that about 80% of all divorces, one person is initiating it over the objections of the other person. Only about 20% of divorces have both parties mutually agree that they should divorce. By the time the person initiates it, they've actually made the psychological decision about 2 years prior to announcing it. They've gone through various stages.
This is that 80% person, the doer, the one who wants the divorce.
Usually made the decision, the psychological decision, a couple of years before.
What did they wait 2 years for?
Because they're ambivalent, hopeful. Hope springs eternal, I guess. But when you look at the research, or when I've talked with people, it's usually about 2 years beforehand that they really made the final decision.
Well, isn't it
and they
also
just
that,
hung on for a while.
But I wonder if their hanging on has to do with what you're saying. You always give up something, even in a marriage that isn't working for you. You're still giving up something.
You're giving up a lot.
So it's hard to say goodbye, even.
Yeah.
even
And there's a lot of guilt. People who initiate divorce experience a tremendous amount of guilt and shame. I've talked to people who thought that they were going to lose all of their friends. I had one very successful businessman who thought that his business would go down the tubes as soon as his image as a happily married man went away. So people experience a lot of shame and guilt and are reluctant to announce that they're going to make the final decision.
So my question is not that simple. If I say, how many should have not done it and worked on the marriage, it's kind of an unanswerable question. I mean, do you see that tragedy?
We have statistics on it.
Okay.
We have statistics on people who actually initiate a divorce. Of the people who initiate a divorce, about a third try to reconcile, but only 1 out of 10 of those are successful. So the odds are about, by the time they actually file for divorce, the odds are about 1 in 30 of a successful reconciliation. That being said, I meet with a lot of people that if I had seen them 3 or 4 years before, could probably have resolved their marital difficulties.
How do you know?
Because the types of difficulties that they had were solvable. It's just that the strategies that they used to solve them failed.
So it's not just you married the wrong person.
Oh, no. No. The reason people get divorced, predominantly, the reason people get divorced is they fail to master the control issue in the relationship. The first phase of any marriage involves your object value or being included by the other person. You have characteristics, whether it be superficial like your looks or whether it be deep like some of your values. You have various aspects to you that are appealing to the other person. Once that phase is over and you begin to move on in the relationship, the next phase is the control phase. It's when two people have to work out all the details of personal differences. And that could be everything from how often they like affection to how to manage a checkbook. You have to work out your differences. Many people have things that they don't have differences on. Most couples have a few things that are kind of sticklers that are really tough to work through. And that's a control process, and both parties in a marriage have to have some say-so in how the marriage goes. And people who end up getting divorced, we know this from the research, most of the time it's because they clashed in the way they tried to deal with the control issues.
Is that the same as resolving conflict? How are you going to work things out? How are you going to work things through differences?
How you're going to work your differences out.
This is not Hollywood. That doesn't sound very Hollywood-esque, because I always thought it's people who really realize they're not a good match. That I don't really deeply love the other person. I married them because I was lonely or on the rebound or whatever. But you're saying it's really more mechanics.
Well, you're describing a type of divorce, often with people without children, where they discovered buyer's regret fairly quickly after they got married. Okay. And I've seen lots of those. I saw one case where they were married a year, the woman just up and left. Because she just discovered she was with somebody that she really didn't like. Yeah. So you're describing a kind of divorce that happens usually fairly early. When I'm talking about the control issues, I'm talking about marriages that have lasted at least 7 or 8 years.
Oh, okay.
And those people are divorcing mostly for control-related problems.
So it's not a waste with the quick divorce. That should have happened anyway because it just wasn't the right match. But the longer marriages, there's waste in that they could have gotten help.
Correct.
Okay. Is there any time in a longer-term marriage when you definitely should get a divorce? It wasn't help you needed. It wasn't someone like you to work out your differences. You should divorce.
Yes. Yes, there's some of it's pretty obvious. There are some marriages in which conduct problems become a real issue. Somebody who drinks heavily suddenly becomes addicted to alcohol, and their spouse wants to leave before they hit the bottom.
Yes.
Some people end up with problems with anger management,
abuse.
and those are situations where somebody should get a divorce.
Okay, so now we're at this point. They're getting a divorce. This is where we begin, at least what we set out to do today. Can you tell us the most common mistakes people make going through the divorce process?
The most common mistakes is people, I would say that most people enter the divorce process frightened of their futures, frightened of what's going to happen financially. And I'm speaking mostly about people who don't have children or who have adult children. They're frightened of what to tell their children if they are adults. They're frightened of what's going to happen with their friendships. And yielding to that fear and starting to be very selfish and self-protective is probably the biggest mistake, because what's actually happening if you don't have minor children, what's actually happening is you're going through a financial transition. And like any financial transition, you would do best if you sat back, talked about what your goals, what your financial goals were, took a look at what your resources are, and started working towards your financial goals. If you saw it as a planning opportunity as opposed to something to be frightened of.
Yeah.
But most people address it as from the perspective of being frightened, and they get attorneys that try and protect their interests and get them the biggest cut of the pie that they can get. Instead of really doing some financial planning. People make impulsive decisions like wanting to get the house or not wanting to get the house, instead of making good financial decisions with regard to their futures. So I'd say the biggest mistake is that people let their emotions run away with them, and let their fear especially run away with them when they make decisions through the divorce process.
I thought you'd say anger. Someone who's that person on the other end who's being abandoned would want revenge, or they'd want the big chunk to take it out of the hide of the person who's rejecting them.
Sometimes that's the case. There's a type of divorce where somebody begins to engage in kind of a downward spiral, and they don't mind if they end up with nothing, just as long as the other person ends up with nothing. That's actually pretty rare. At least I don't see it that often.
Now, I know some of your best friends are lawyers, but I'll ask you this anyway. Can lawyers really screw things up where they make it adversarial where it might not have been if the lawyers weren't that way?
Well, the answer, most family law attorneys are really good people who don't do things like that. But they take an oath to protect the interests of their client. They don't take any oaths to protect the interests of the other client. And they, in a sense, are paid to be somewhat paranoid. They're paid to be frightened of all of the possible eventualities that can occur. And so to some extent, some of the conflicts that people go through in a divorce are driven by their attorneys actually giving them good advice.
But it doesn't sound like good advice if it creates this kind of adversarial fighting for your side. Because I'm hearing you suggest the best thing is step back and kind of calm down, take a deep breath, and think, what do you need? Not what can you get? So it sounds like, from what you're saying, I'd put together the lawyer's hurting you by doing that.
Well, I hate to say it as a lawyer hurting them, because oftentimes it's helping the client face some of the realities in the legal system. But it is a conflictual process. There's one person or one couple cannot hire one attorney in order to conduct their divorce, because there's an assumption in the law that the interests of the parties are adverse to one another. And so each party has to have their own attorney. Well, that assumption that your interests are adverse to one another starts the battle off, starts the conflict off, and the attorneys are just championing your personal best interests, and unfortunately that can be a competitive process. So it does add to some of the conflict, but it's the way the legal system is set up.
Okay, so now you're just switching careers. You've been a psychologist, and tomorrow you wake up a divorce lawyer. In comes a divorce client to your office. Do you do anything different than any other divorce lawyer, given your knowledge? Do you give them a little talk first to represent what Ken Waldron just said?
I would handle it a little bit differently than the way most attorneys handle it. The way I would handle it, I would ask that client what his long-term goals were, what kind of financial goals he had. We're talking about people without children.
Yes.
Then I would ask him, what do you think your spouse's long-term goals are? And I would start helping my client put together proposals that took into consideration his goals and her goals. Because ultimately I think that both of the parties are going to be more satisfied with an outcome that was fair and equitable, but also that took into consideration both of their goals. And sometimes that means designing a divorce a little bit differently than a standard might be. For example, a person might, in the end, want to pay more maintenance in the short term in order to help his or her spouse reach a certain goal. And that might mean less maintenance in the long term. So by really considering it as a financial planning process for both of the parties, I think it would be a little less conflictual.
But wouldn't you be in trouble, Ken Waldron, the lawyer, because the other lawyer is not saying the same thing to the client on the other side?
Yes. I would be in trouble, particularly if my client might be satisfied that it was a really good deal for both of them. Mm-hmm. But my client might learn later that he could have got a better deal had I been more adversarial. Mm-hmm. And so I'm opening myself up for some liability there.
Yeah. But isn't your client in the end happier because they didn't have to go through the grief of a acrimonious divorce?
That would be my assumption, but I don't know that. That my client might go talk to another attorney and said, "Oh, you were very poorly represented. You shouldn't have had to pay that much, or you shouldn't have had to give away that many assets," and it can become a problem for me down the road. So it's complicated.
So it sounds. One of the things I guess I'd like to tweak out of this is advice for dealing with your divorce lawyer when you're going through this process. You have any counsel for people when they walk into the lawyer's office?
In many of the mediations I do, the parties have attorneys, and they ask me for coaching on how to deal with their attorneys. And I'm reluctant to do that because in my estimation, that's stepping on some toes.
Oh, bad politics?
Well, it's not bad politics. I think it's really overstepping the bounds of what I'm doing.
Oh, okay.
But people do. A lot of people come to mediation who are not happy with the way their lawyers are handling the case.
These are both parties, the husband and
parties.
wife, both come to you for mediation. Because now I was going, okay, but now these are strangers listening to you right now, Ken. And what do you whisper in their ear as to, when you go to your lawyer, fill in the blank?
When you go to your lawyer, I would say to really focus on, if you don't have children, to really focus on it as a financial planning process. Because lawyers have a lot of information about financial planning. They know the tax implications of many decisions, and so they can be of great assistance in taking somebody through that if that's their directive. And I would also say, tell your lawyer, these are some of the goals that I know my spouse has, and I would feel best about this divorce if we tried to come up with an arrangement that also helped my spouse reach his or her goals.
Even if you hate their guts? Your spouse right now?
You hate your guts. You may hate the guts of your spouse while you're going through the process. 5 years later, you're going to be much happier with the way you handled it if you deal with it that way, I think.
Okay, I might be pushing a point, but you'll be happier because what, you feel better about yourself, or that you acted with dignity?
The emotions of the divorce past, the guilt, the shame, the rage, whatever the feelings that the parties have at the time of the divorce pass. And what people are left with later is their character and how they look at how they conduct themselves at difficult times in their lives.
That's interesting.
Somebody that knows that they really messed up the life of their spouse during the divorce is not going to be a happy camper 3 years later after that rage is gone.
Because they'll feel bad about themselves.
Correct.
Wow. Of course, if there's not children involved, you don't have to suffer the relationship with your ex very much. That's done, right? You know.
Not necessarily. Sometimes there are continuing financial obligations to one another that go well beyond the divorce.
Are there any other major mistakes people tend to make going through the divorce process besides going for the jugular financially?
I would say that some people start the divorce process without really knowing why they're doing it. And I think that most people would benefit from meeting with a counselor, a marriage counselor, not so much to repair the marriage, but to meet with the marriage counselor for 8 or 10 times to really examine what happened in the relationship and why they're going through it. I think most people, what they think is, when you're going through a divorce, your sense of wellness is really injured. And people,
both sides.
Both sides. And people tell themselves stories to try to repair that sense of wellness. And almost always the stories they tell themselves about why they're getting a divorce are wrong. They're distortions. They usually are blaming one another. And sometimes with some good reason. There are some real things that people do that are hurtful. But the stories that people tell themselves have distortions in them, and then they go on in their lives without really having learned anything.
But
so I think most people would benefit from...
That's a hard sell, Ken. How can you talk someone who's going through a divorce to go get 10 sessions with a marriage counselor with their spouse about why this didn't work out?
I do it all the time.
Really?
I get many people in divorce mediation that once they're there, I ask them a few questions about if they're sure about the decision, and most people still have some ambivalence. And if I see any ambivalence at all, I strongly recommend that they go talk to a counselor 6, 8, 10 times and really examine why they're getting a divorce, because most of the time it's not what they think.
If they've already had marriage counseling and it didn't work, are you done with that then? Don't recommend that?
Correct. It depends on the marriage counseling, but if they've had good marriage counseling and they've clearly identified what the problems are, maybe they have very, very little in common, for example, which is one of the biggest reasons that people who've been married for a long time get a divorce. They find out they don't have much in common after the kids are gone. But if they've been through good marriage counseling and they have a good understanding of why they're getting a divorce, then I wouldn't recommend it.
From your experience, when you do send people who haven't had marriage counseling to see a marriage counselor to find out why they're breaking up, what's the real reasons, what's going on, how often do they then stay together? They go, oh, we could fix that.
Rarely. Rarely. It's really, I don't fully understand why it's so hard to repair some relationships, even when people want to. I see situations, and I had one couple where they didn't have kids. They were planning on having kids, but they'd been married for about 7 years, very happily married, very deeply in love, a lot in common. But the woman at a office party got a little drunk and impulsively had a one-night stand, and they just couldn't get that background noise out of their marriage. And
I imagine the guy couldn't.
Pardon me?
I imagine it was the man who couldn't.
Every time the woman looked at him, she felt guilty for the damage she'd done to him.
Wow.
Neither of them could get that background noise out. They went through mediation. Halfway through mediation, they decided to try and reconcile. They were back a year later to finish their mediation. Just couldn't do it.
Wow.
And they loved each other. They cried when we finished the mediation. It was sad.
That's really sad.
But I think some harm can be done that just can't be repaired in some relationships.
And when people do get this, they take a recommendation, get 8 sessions, what kind of things do they learn as they continue to go through and come back to you and say, okay, we're ready for the mediation, we've had our 8 sessions with our marriage counselor? What do they learn?
One of the things that I see when they do that, one of the things that I see is that the emotions, the level of emotionalism is gone or is heavily reduced. There's not as much guilt, there's not as much shame, there's not as much anger, and people are able to be more objective in their planning for their futures. I would say that's the biggest difference.
Yeah, I would
is
think
that
their
they're
life would
more
be real
objective.
clearer, much clearer after that, not internally as disjointed for each one. Having to hold on to the anger. I left her because she was so bad at blah, blah, blah. You feel it versus, oh, well, it didn't work out for these complex reasons of our matching or whatever. And so I would think you'd have more peace going forward in your life.
They do. And they've learned something about themselves, too. They've learned the mistakes that they've made that at least they might not repeat in their next relationship.
Think they will? The odds are they will. You're smiling like they tend to keep making the same mistakes.
People's bad habits are pretty persistent. So
you find that, like a lot of people pick the same trouble they picked the first time in the next partner?
I don't know that I have enough experience with
Yeah.
second relationships to really know the answer to that question.
When should people get a mediator versus just going to their attorneys?
Well, I'm a mediator. You're asking. I think mediation is an absolutely wonderful way to go through the process of arriving at some decisions because it is a goal-based planning process. So I'm a firm believer in mediation.
But you got two lawyers here that are, the model is they're fighting each other for the best interest of their client. It's adversarial. Does this take it out of the adversarial when you go to a mediator?
Some mediation is adversarial. People represent their own interests and sometimes argue over what the best solution to a particular problem is. They have different goals. Their goals might conflict. And the process of mediation is a process of problem solving those differences as opposed to fighting about them.
Well, they're fighting your problem solving as the mediator, right? You're trying to get
Correct.
them to
Correct.
on the
So
same page.
the notion that mediation is this real friendly, amicable process is really a misnomer. People get pretty heated in mediation, but mediation is a forum in which they can maintain control over those decisions. If they're talking separately with attorneys and the attorneys are trying to appease their clients by sending nasty letters to one another, then they're not. They really lose control of the process.
Is it expensive, divorce law? Going through an adversarial divorce?
It really depends on how complicated your financial case is. If you have a real simple financial case, it's not that expensive.
Even if you're fighting over the small amount?
Well, most people don't fight, and mediation. I don't think mediation is a particularly useful tool if people are entering the divorce process with a small estate, a few items that are pretty perfunctory. Lawyers can take them through that process really rather easily. A lot of lawyers will take their clients through the process well and use mediation as part of the process. They'll identify points of dispute, and they'll send their clients to a mediator specifically to deal with just maybe a narrow dispute. So I really believe that people going through divorce should have lawyers. I think lawyers are wonderful guides, knowledgeable about the whole process and about the law. The legal system is counterintuitive. It doesn't work the way most people think it should work or does work. And lawyers know the system and can take people through it and come out the other end in good shape. I just believe that mediation is a good forum in which to deal with certain types of problems.
As we close, Ken, can you suggest any resources, websites, or whatever for people who are embarking on this process if they want to say, I want to get up to speed and at least know what I don't know about this process?
Well, there are a number of books that are written about what it's like to go through a divorce. There aren't many books on what it's like to interface with the legal system. I really think that's why I think divorce lawyers are so helpful, because sitting down with a divorce lawyer and talking about what a person is likely to run into in the legal system can be very educational. And I don't know of any websites that do that.
I'm surprised that he says, you're kind of saying put your faith in your divorce lawyer, and I thought you'd say be careful because they're out to get as much as they can for you, and they're going to make a fuss and kick up dirt.
Very few family law attorneys, divorce lawyers, in my experience, are like that. There are a few troublemakers, but for the most part, they're pretty good people who are good guides through a difficult process. It's a competitive process. That's the only thing I would say be careful of, is it is a competitive process. It's set up that way. It's not the lawyer's fault for it being set up that way. So you do have to be careful of getting into the competition and steer the attorneys in the direction of a more collaborative process.
Okay, between you and I, let's figure out things people could walk away from, because when you listen to the interview, if you ask about it 3 months later, people remember 1 or 2 ideas and that's it. So, idea 1, don't let your rage rule. Is that?
Idea 1, don't let your fear rule.
Fear
I would say fear creates more problems for people than the anger.
And to overcome that fear?
Usually it's helpful to go talk to a counselor, even 3 or 4 sessions, to address what you're frightened of.
A marriage
Can
counselor.
be a marriage counselor.
With your spouse?
I think so.
Okay. And if they won't come?
Then by yourself.
Okay.
And to specifically address the things that you're frightened of. It's helpful to have somebody, particularly somebody with some experience, to get your feet on the ground and learn that a lot of the things that people are frightened of really don't happen.
And I'm hearing implicitly the second piece of advice is don't go for the maximum of everything you might get. Look at the whole picture. Look at your spouse's situation and yours and so on, and what you need and want out of it.
Correct.
Okay.
And what your spouse's goals are too, because in the end you have to live with yourself.
And on the next program, Ken is coming back to talk about issues when there are children involved. Ken, thanks very much for being with us, and I hope you'll join us on that next edition of Insights.